You think you know King Henry VIII, the burly monarch with 6 wives, the man who split from Rome to build his own church, the face plastered across every textbook as England's most infamous king. But what if I told you that the real Henry was so much more monstrous, so much more physically and morally decayed than you've ever been led to believe? His final years weren't a royal tragedy. They were a full-blown horror story. The man who ruled with divine authority ended up trapped inside a body that was literally rotting from the inside out. This isn't the tale of a great king's decline. It's the grotesque unraveling of a man who became his own worst nightmare. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at those portraits of Henry VIII the same way again. Because behind that confident smirk and jeweled crown was a human catastrophe. His body, his mind, and his kingdom, all falling apart at the seams. We're diving straight into the final gut-churning days of a monarch whose corpse made history for all the wrong reasons. So, let's go back to the moment when the great King Henry VIII stopped being a man and started becoming a monster. By the last decade of his life, Henry wasn't walking, he was being hauled. His waist measured 54 inches, his weight somewhere around 400 pounds. But his sheer size wasn't the true horror. It was the smell. The king's legs were covered in ulcers that oozed pus so foul it drove servants out of the room gagging. Royal attendants had to draw straws to decide who would change his bandages, and getting the short straw was as close to torture as court life could get. One chronicler described approaching the king as standing in the presence of death itself. Imagine the most powerful man in the world, yet his body was so far gone that people had to hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces just to stand beside him. But this wasn't just bad hygiene. The wounds were symptoms of something far darker. Henry had suffered a horrific jousting accident in 1536, a blow to the head so severe that he was unconscious for 2 hours. In modern terms, that's a traumatic brain injury. After that day, something inside Henry changed. The charming young king who once wrote music and poetry turned paranoid, violent, and utterly unhinged. He executed friends, wives, and advisors on the faintest suspicion of betrayal. He'd fly into fits of rage so violent that even his physicians refused to treat him without armed guards nearby. Modern experts now believe that along with brain trauma, Henry may have suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that could explain his extreme weight gain, mood swings, and those repulsive leg ulcers that never healed. But back then, nobody dared suggest such a thing. To question the king's health was to question God's will. And in Henry's world, that was treason. His courtiers had to pretend that the bloated, diseased man before them was still the handsome warrior of his youth. They praised his radiant strength while secretly burning incense to mask the stench of infection. Inside his private chambers, the reality was beyond disturbing. Henry could barely stand. Servants had to carry him between rooms in a reinforced chair fitted with pulleys and wheels, and even that short journey left him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. His bowels were failing. He required special padded seats because he often lost control during meals. This was the man who had once commanded armies, now reduced to a wheezing, festering mass of flesh and rage. And through it all, he still demanded to be worshipped as the embodiment of divine power. The irony was grotesque. While Henry's body decayed, his ego only grew. He surrounded himself with mirrors and demanded new portraits painted with flattering angles to hide his deformities. One painter, Hans Holbein, was ordered to exaggerate Henry's size and stance, creating that famous wide-legged power pose that we still recognize today. What the portrait doesn't show is that the real Henry needed help just to stand for those sessions, but perhaps the only thing more terrifying than Henry's physical collapse was the way it warped his mind. His paranoia metastasized into full-blown tyranny. He trusted no one, not even his own children. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he believed they were plotting to overthrow him. It didn't matter that they were teenagers. To Henry, Everyone was a potential traitor. His court became a psychological minefield. Nobles whispered in corners, terrified that a misplaced word might be overheard and twisted into treason. Servants were executed for gossip. People learned to smile in the king's presence, even when he humiliated them, because one frown could mean death. Henry's paranoia infected everyone around him. Ministers betrayed each other, families turned on their kin, and England itself began to suffocate under the weight of his suspicion. And yet, in this collapsing empire of fear, Henry still demanded feasts worthy of a god. His appetite was legendary, 5,000 calories a day, sometimes more. He devoured roasted pigs, whole chickens, and mountains of bread dripping with butter, all washed down with oceans of wine. But here's the sick twist. Henry believed certain foods held magical powers. He thought eating swan would make him graceful, venison would make him strong, oysters would make him more virile. So he gorged himself on these so-called royal superfoods until his own body became the ultimate proof that magic doesn't work. Every bite was tested by servants terrified of being poisoned. They had to taste the food and wait 30 minutes before Henry dared to eat. The meals were so elaborate, they resembled ceremonies, 4-hour spectacles of gluttony and paranoia, performed in front of hundreds of courtiers pretending this was all normal. Imagine sitting in silence while your king, sweating and trembling, struggled to chew through mountains of meat as his wounds seeped beneath layers of silk. And still, the show had to go on. The kitchen employed over 200 people working around the clock to prepare food that Henry often left unfinished. Some dishes were never even touched. They were paraded before him purely to display abundance. Waste was a symbol of power. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, England starved under crushing taxes. Peasants buried children from famine while their king dined on swan and sugar pies. But the more his body failed, the more he clung to excess. Eating became his last act of control, the one thing he could still command. And in that grotesque act of indulgence, we see the perfect metaphor for Henry's reign, a man devouring everything around him, including himself. That was only the beginning of the nightmare. Because as Henry's health collapsed and his sanity twisted into full-blown delusion, his paranoia reached a new, horrifying peak. His final months wouldn't just mark the end of a reign, they would mark the total disintegration of a human being who believed himself divine. By the time Henry reached his final years, the royal palace had transformed into a fortress of fear. Every corner echoed with paranoia. His private chambers were fitted with hidden passages, peepholes and trapdoors, not for luxury, but for escape. He didn't trust his guards, his servants, or even his wives. At night, Henry would lie awake, surrounded by armed attendants who watched him sleep with crossbows in hand. Imagine being so terrified of your own shadow that even closing your eyes felt like a risk. His mind had become a battlefield where every whisper was treason and every glance could be death. He even ordered the kitchens, his most sacred domain of indulgence, to be locked and guarded. Meals were prepared under armed supervision, every spice and salt grain examined for poison. He created an entire network of spies to monitor his nobles, and then, in a twist of madness, hired spies to watch those spies. The entire court became a web of deceit where no one could trust anyone else. Even the walls seemed to have ears, and Henry wanted it that way. His obsession with betrayal turned England's royal household into something that resembled a medieval surveillance state. This was no longer the realm of a king. It was the lair of a madman. He began executing people based on dreams, visions, or vague prophecies. If someone dreamt that the king might die, that dreamer was sentenced to death. One servant was tortured simply for hesitating when asked if Henry looked healthy that morning. The man's hesitation was taken as proof of treason. The Tower of London overflowed with victims of the king's imagination. Friends, priests, scholars, even family members. And through all this chaos, Henry's body continued to betray him. The ulcers on his legs had grown so deep that his bones were visible. His physicians, terrified to tell him the truth, tried to soothe the pain with boiling oil and herbal poultices, treatments that often made things worse. The smell that radiated from his wounds was so vile that entire corridors were perfumed with lavender just to mask it. Courtiers joked, quietly, that the king could be found by scent alone. Servants who dressed him were forced to scrape away layers of decaying skin from his bandages each morning. When his infection spread to his lower abdomen, it caused constant swelling and unbearable pain. Henry screamed through the nights, his roars echoing down palace halls like a wounded beast. He accused the doctors of witchcraft, convinced that someone had cursed his flesh. At one point, he ordered one of his own physicians executed for failing to cure what God had blessed him with. It was divine punishment, he said, a test that only the chosen could endure. But even divine right couldn't hide the truth anymore. The once golden monarch had become a spectacle of suffering. His servants carried him from room to room in a wheeled chair, and at banquets, he demanded that no one look at him unless spoken to. Mirrors were removed from his chambers. He couldn't stand to see the monster he had become. Yet, he continued to rule with iron cruelty, signing death warrants with trembling hands and demanding new laws to punish imagined enemies. When Catherine Howard, his teenage queen, was accused of infidelity, Henry's paranoia turned sadistic. She was barely 19 when she was dragged to the Tower. The king refused to see her before her execution, claiming she was unworthy of divine sight. But he did order the scaffold to be freshly painted, so her blood would be more visible when it spilled. The act wasn't justice. It was theatre, a macabre performance designed to remind everyone that even in decay, Henry's wrath was absolute. By his last year, the court had learned to speak in whispers, to bow lower, to never mention illness or death in the king's presence. But Henry knew. He could feel his body rotting faster each day. His appetite faded, wine soured in his mouth. His leg wounds began to ooze black fluid, a sign that the infection had reached his bloodstream. He was dying, and everyone knew it, except no one dared say it aloud. When his confessor suggested he prepare his soul, Henry had the man dismissed and replaced with someone more obedient. He refused to confess his sins. "Kings," he said, "answer only to God, and I am God's voice." In his final weeks, even God seemed to abandon him. He spent his last nights raving in feverish delusion, muttering to ghosts only he could see. He'd talk to his dead wives, sometimes cursing them, sometimes begging them for forgiveness. His servants reported hearing him scream Anne Boleyn's name, shouting that she was coming for him, her headless body dripping blood across the floor. Whether it was infection or guilt that drove those hallucinations, no one knew. But it didn't matter anymore. The king, who had once commanded the destiny of nations, now sat alone in his chamber, babbling to shadows, too weak to lift his crown. And then came the end. Henry's final breath was not majestic, it was revolting. His body was so swollen with fluid that his skin split open as he lay dying. The stench filled the room before he was even gone. His attendants, desperate to maintain dignity, sealed the windows and stuffed herbs into the bed linens. But it was useless. When his heart stopped, no one wanted to go near him to confirm it. They waited for hours, terrified that he might still wake and accuse them of treason. Even in death, Henry found a way to cause chaos. His body, bloated and unstable, began to decompose faster than anyone expected. The royal embalmers tried to wrap him in layers of cloth soaked in lead and pitch, but the pressure inside the corpse kept growing. By the time they sealed him into his coffin, the gases of decay were already swelling beneath his skin. When they loaded the coffin for transport to Windsor, it was leaking. And then, horror struck. The heat of the journey caused the gases to expand, and the coffin burst open. The explosion was so violent that attendants screamed as the stench filled the air. Royal remains spattered across the inside of the hearse. Witnesses later claimed that dogs followed the procession, licking up what had dripped onto the road. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The king, who once called himself divine, reduced to a feast for stray animals. And yet, even after burial, Henry refused to rest. The grave was dug wider than usual to accommodate his massive body, but the ground couldn't bear the weight. It caved in repeatedly as workers struggled to seal the tomb. For weeks afterward, visitors reported strange noises coming from beneath the stone. Some said it was the devil claiming what was his. Others said it was the king, still raging against the one enemy he could never conquer, his own mortality. Henry VIII's final days weren't just the end of a ruler. They were the collapse of an empire built on fear, greed, and blood. His body rotted, his kingdom fractured, and his legacy curdled into something grotesque. Power had consumed him, hollowed him out, and left behind nothing but decay. If this dive into the most horrifying royal downfall in history left you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, history, and the myth of divine kingship, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stick around. There are countless more truths buried beneath the polished stories you learned in school, and trust me, the next one might disturb you even more. By the time Henry's monstrous corpse was lowered into the earth, the air around England felt cursed. His death didn't bring relief. It spread terror. Courtiers who had spent years tiptoeing around his rage suddenly found themselves facing a new kind of fear. What would happen now that the tyrant was gone? The kingdom was a rotting reflection of its master, bleeding wealth, crippled by paranoia, and stinking of betrayal. Ministers burned documents, destroyed letters, and swore they had always been loyal. Nobody wanted to be remembered as one of Henry's confidants, because to be close to him was to be tainted by his madness. Inside the palace, the servants who had once tended to the king's festering wounds whispered stories about his final hours. They swore the stench of his body lingered for weeks, that you could still smell him in the tapestries. Some claimed they heard dragging sounds in the night, as if his heavy body was being hauled through the corridors again. But it wasn't just superstition. His death had left a void so massive that people could feel it. This was a kingdom haunted by the man who ruled it, both literally and psychologically. Even before the coffin burst, Henry's final days had already poisoned his legacy. Those who saw him near the end spoke of a creature barely human. He couldn't move without help. His flesh had gone grayish-yellow, his eyes sunken, his lips cracked and peeling. He'd lost teeth, and his breath smelled like rot. The ulcers on his legs had merged into gaping craters, and his body was constantly oozing through his clothes. At one point, the stench grew so unbearable that even his favorite hunting dogs refused to approach him. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, yet your own animals recoiled from you. And yet, amid this decay, Henry's delusions of grandeur never faded. He insisted on being dressed in velvet and jewels, as if sheer opulence could disguise the horror of what he'd become. He demanded that courtiers bow lower, that servants address him as the living image of God. The contrast was surreal, a bloated corpse pretending to be divine. People obeyed, not out of reverence, but out of raw, animal fear. One account describes Henry's final banquet, held just months before his death. He sat slumped in his massive chair, wheezing, barely able to lift a goblet to his mouth. But the table before him overflowed, roasted swans, glazed boars' heads, towers of pastries shaped like crowns. Servants had to prop up his arms so he could tear at the food. When wine dribbled down his chin, no one dared wipe it away. He laughed through labored breaths, boasting of his conquests, his wives, his power. It was a ghastly parody of his former glory, an emperor of decay presiding over a feast of denial. Behind the scenes, the palace was collapsing into chaos. His servants were sick, many infected from tending his wounds. Rats infested the lower halls, drawn by the waste and rotting food. The stables stank of filth, because no one dared complain about the king's horses eating better than the people. Royal physicians burned incense to keep from vomiting during their rounds. No one dared tell him the truth. He was dying, and had been for years. And through it all, his paranoia refused to die. Even as he drifted in and out of delirium, he accused his remaining advisors of betrayal. He signed last-minute executions from his bed, condemning men he hadn't seen in months. One was his old ally, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, sent to the Tower on false charges just days before Henry himself expired. The warrant for Howard's execution arrived too late. The king had died before the axe could fall. That's how Henry left this world. His final act was nearly another murder. But death was no mercy. When his coffin exploded and his remains splattered across the road, England saw the literal manifestation of his sins bursting from the grave. Priests tried to spin it as divine punishment, claiming God himself had rejected the king's corpse. And yet, in a twisted way, Henry got what he wanted. He was still feared, even in death. People spoke of him as if he might rise again, furious and bloated, to drag them into the grave with him. Meanwhile, the people he had ruled with terror were left to pick up the pieces of a kingdom built on paranoia. His court was a wasteland of broken families and silenced voices. His surviving wives, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, were left to navigate a world still poisoned by his reputation. Catherine Parr, the last wife, had endured years of psychological torture, forced to play nursemaid to a dying tyrant who alternated between begging her for affection and accusing her of witchcraft. After his death, she fled court life altogether, terrified that even a ghost of Henry might reach out from the beyond to destroy her. And yet, despite the horror, history still tried to clean him up. Painters continued to immortalize him as a proud warrior king. Historians downplayed the filth and cruelty, and generations of students were taught about his political genius. But peel back the polished portraits, and what you find is a man consumed by gluttony, disease, and delusion. His final years weren't a decline, they were a descent into physical and moral putrefaction. Because Henry VIII wasn't just dying, he was decaying while alive. His body leaked, his mind fractured, and his reign became a grotesque reflection of his own sickness. Power had insulated him from consequence until it turned him into a monster. And that's the tragedy of his story. He couldn't be stopped, not by his enemies, not by his conscience, not even by his own collapsing flesh. England under Henry's shadow was a kingdom suffocating under superstition and fear. People whispered that the plague spreading through London in 1546 was the curse of the king, that his sins had called it forth. Clergymen refused to mention his name from the pulpit, and those who had once cheered his every decision began to pray that God would cleanse the throne. They got their wish, but not the peace they expected. Henry's ghost lingered, in the corruption of his church, in the blood of the innocents he executed, and in the nightmares of those who had served him. When night fell over Windsor Castle, the guards said the air turned colder near his tomb. They claimed to hear groaning from beneath the marble, like something still shifting down there. Some said they saw mist rising from the cracks in the floor, smelling faintly of rot and wine. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was England's collective guilt taking form. But for those who lived through Henry's final reign, one truth remained undeniable. His death hadn't freed them. It had only reminded them that monsters don't vanish. They fester. And that's why Henry VIII's story still grips us. It's not about royal power or religious reform. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute authority meets absolute corruption. A man who thought himself godly enough to defy the Pope ended up defied by his own body, his empire, and even the grave itself. So the next time you see that iconic portrait, the proud stance, the bejeweled hands, the gaze that seems to stare straight through you, remember what lies beneath it. Remember the pus, the paranoia, the rotting flesh. Because that's the real Henry VIII. Not a hero of history, but the walking embodiment of its most grotesque truths. And if this deep dive into the horror behind England's most infamous king left you shocked, disturbed, or morbidly fascinated, don't just click away. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because we're just getting started uncovering the dark, twisted corners of history they never dared teach you in school. When Henry's coffin finally stopped leaking and the grave was sealed for good, the people of England expected the nightmare to end. But what followed was worse. A kingdom infected by the same sickness that had consumed its king. His court had been built on fear, and fear doesn't die easily. It lingers, festers, spreads. The courtiers who had once trembled before the king's rotting bulk now turned on each other, desperate to claim scraps of his power. The moment Henry's bloated heart stopped beating, England became a feeding frenzy. His son, Edward VI, was only 9 years old, too young to understand the monstrous shadow he'd inherited. Behind the scenes, men like Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, schemed to rule through the boy king. They paraded the dead monarch's reforms as divine will while secretly bleeding the treasury dry. Henry's paranoia had been replaced by greed, his cruelty by corruption. But make no mistake, the disease was the same. The spirit of the old tyrant still haunted every decision, every whisper in the corridors of power. And as the elite fought for control, the common people suffered. Henry's wars had drained the kingdom of silver. His vanity projects left entire towns destitute. The monasteries he had seized and sold off, his supposed reformation, had once fed the poor and sheltered the sick. Now those same buildings stood empty, looted, their icons smashed, their doors barred. Beggars crowded the streets of London, veterans of Henry's wars begging for crusts of bread beneath the very cathedrals he had desecrated. The king who had eaten like a god left behind a nation starving like beasts. Plague followed soon after. The same year Henry was buried, London was struck by outbreaks of sweating sickness and smallpox. To many, it felt like divine retribution. People whispered that the disease had crawled from the king's corpse, that the rot of his flesh had seeped into the soil and spread through the air. Priests preached that England was purging itself of sin. Others claimed to see omens, black clouds over Windsor, rivers running red with rust. Whether superstition or not, the fear was real. Henry's decay had become a national contagion. Meanwhile, in the palace, Catherine Parr, the last wife, was doing everything she could to escape the echo of her dead husband. She had survived him, yes, but survival didn't mean peace. She still heard his voice in her dreams, barking orders, calling her a witch, accusing her of poisoning him. Even after his death, his spies kept reporting on her conversations as if the dead king still demanded control. She remarried quickly, hoping to bury her past beneath a new name. But when she died in childbirth 2 years later, many whispered it was Henry's curse claiming her at last. Anne of Cleves, the wife who had escaped with her head intact, fared better. She lived quietly in the countryside, wealthy and wary, never speaking the king's name again. But even she wasn't free. Her servants said she refused to light candles at night because the flicker reminded her of Henry's feverish eyes. She died of natural causes in 1557, the only one of his 6 wives to outlive his dynasty. A footnote in history, but perhaps the luckiest woman in Tudor England. And then there was Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon. The trauma her father inflicted on her ran so deep that it twisted her into something he would have recognized, a ruler as ruthless as himself. When she came to power years later, she burned hundreds at the stake for heresy, convinced she was cleansing England of the filth her father had unleashed. Historians called her Bloody Mary, but perhaps she was simply her father's final legacy, his madness reborn in another form. Everywhere you looked, Henry's presence clung to the living like a ghost. His portraits hung in castles across the realm, and people swore that his eyes followed them. At Hampton Court, Guards reported hearing heavy footsteps echoing through the Great Hall, even when the rooms were empty. They said the smell of decay would suddenly fill the air, briefly, unmistakably, before vanishing again. Once, a maid claimed to see a massive figure limping down the corridor, dragging one leg behind him, leaving a trail of dark stains on the floor. When she followed, the prince ended at a locked door, the king's old bedchamber. But maybe the most haunting legacy of all wasn't the ghost stories. It was the silence. For generations, England tried to forget. Chroniclers softened his story, calling him complex or misunderstood. They praised his political reforms and his contributions to music, ignoring the fact that the man behind those achievements had turned his own body into a grotesque spectacle of suffering. Even his tombstone lied, inscribed with words of glory and divine purpose. Nothing about Henry's life was divine. It was a slow-motion collapse of flesh, faith, and sanity, a warning carved into history's bones. You see, Henry's story isn't just a tale of one man's decay, it's a reflection of power itself. Give a human absolute authority, strip away consequence, and watch what happens. The body swells, the mind rots, the heart turns black. The man who once wrote love songs and dreamed of chivalry became the very monster he thought he ruled over. He burned friends for treason, discarded wives like garments, and devoured his people's faith the same way he devoured his food, greedily, without restraint, until there was nothing left. And yet, that's exactly why his story endures. It's not about history, it's about the human condition. Henry VIII is what happens when ego triumphs over empathy, when appetite replaces morality. His grotesque death wasn't a punishment. It was poetic justice. The body that he worshipped, that he dressed in gold and silks, betrayed him in the most humiliating way possible. It rotted while he was still alive, exposing the rot that had been inside him all along. When the church bells finally tolled for Henry's death, the sound didn't signify peace. It signified release. England exhaled cautiously, as though afraid the sound might wake him. The same people who had once knelt before his throne now spoke his name only in whispers. The tyrant was gone, but the fear remained. And that's the cruelest twist of all. Henry's power outlived him, not through honor or love, but through the terror he left behind. So, when history calls him the Great King, remember this. Greatness doesn't always shine. Sometimes it festers. Sometimes it reeks, and sometimes it explodes in a coffin, spraying the world with the residue of its own corruption. Henry VIII didn't just die, he infected history itself. If this glimpse into England's most grotesque monarch made you rethink everything you thought you knew about royalty, power, and human decay, don't look away now. Hit that subscribe button because the next story might be even darker, and trust me, you'll want to see how deep history's rot really goes. History remembers Henry VIII as the man who reshaped religion, but it forgets that he did it not out of faith, but out of appetite. The Church of England wasn't born from divine conviction. It was born from lust, ego, and rage. He tore his country apart, just to satisfy his own desire for control, for heirs, for adoration. And when he finally got what he wanted, he destroyed it all anyway. Every act of his reign was driven by hunger, not holiness. He devoured power, people, and principle until there was nothing left but a broken kingdom and a bloated corpse that couldn't even rest in peace. And that's the cruelest irony of all. Henry's obsession with control, the thing that defined his entire existence, was the very thing he lost most completely at the end. His body defied him. His mind betrayed him. His kingdom fractured the moment he drew his final breath. For decades he'd ruled through terror, believing that fear was the same thing as loyalty. But the second he was gone, the fear only turned inward. The nobles who survived him lived the rest of their lives haunted. looking over their shoulders for enemies who didn't exist. The king who trusted no one created a world where trust itself was impossible. And yet, even centuries later, Henry's rot never truly disappeared. Walk into Hampton Court today and you can still feel it. The cold air, the strange heaviness that presses against your chest. Tour guides tell sanitized stories of his grandeur, his 6 wives, his reformations. But behind the velvet ropes and restored portraits, there's something older lingering in those halls. Guards still report hearing thuds in the night, as if someone impossibly heavy were dragging himself across the stone floors. The walls, they say, still carry the smell of decay when the air turns damp. You can almost hear the echo of a man too powerful to admit that he was dying. Even in death, Henry refused to be forgotten. His name became mythology, his sins whitewashed by politics, his cruelty softened by time. But history has a way of peeling back the layers eventually. And when you strip away the romanticism, what's left is the truth. A man consumed by his appetites, undone by his own flesh, and remembered more for his grotesque humanity than his divine right. The tragedy of Henry VIII isn't that he died rotting. It's that he lived believing he was untouchable. He ruled a world that bowed to him, that flattered his delusions, that built entire churches to excuse his sins. And that world paid for it. England spent generations recovering from his damage, the executions, the bankruptcies, the religious chaos. His legacy wasn't glory, it was trauma. Think about it. A single man's pride reshaped an empire, severed centuries of faith, and cost countless lives. All because he couldn't accept that he was mortal. He wanted control over everything. His wives, his subjects, even God himself. But in the end, his own body laughed in his face. It betrayed him, humiliated him, exposed him. The ulcers that ate through his flesh were the perfect metaphor for what was happening inside his soul. Unchecked rot, spreading until nothing sacred remained. And yet, people still glorify him. They call him larger than life, as if that were something to admire. They paint his tyranny as charisma, his paranoia as strength. But take away the crown, the silks, the throne, and what was he really? A terrified man hiding inside his own legend. A human being eaten alive by the consequences of his own ego. Maybe that's why Henry VIII's story still fascinates us. It's not just history, it's a mirror. Because deep down, his downfall isn't just the tale of one king. It's a warning to anyone who believes power can protect them from their own decay. Whether it's kings, dictators, or modern leaders, the same truth always wins. The body breaks, the lies collapse, and the smell of corruption always seeps through the perfume. In his final hours, as he lay gasping for air, Henry is said to have muttered a single line: "Monks, monks, monks." Some believe he was haunted by the souls of the monks he'd ordered executed when he destroyed the monasteries. Others say it was nonsense, a fevered hallucination. But maybe it was guilt. Maybe, for the first time in his life, the great King Henry VIII saw the weight of what he'd done, the blood on his hands, the ruins of his faith, the kingdom drowning in his shadow. And in that moment, even he couldn't pretend to be divine. He died, not as a king, but as a man who'd finally met a power greater than himself. Decay. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The man who built an empire of fear was eaten by the very thing he tried to command: his own flesh. The body he worshipped turned against him. The church he created out of pride became his tombstone. The power he wielded turned to dust in his hands. And now, centuries later, we remember him not for greatness, but for the grotesque lesson his life carved into history, that absolute power doesn't make you godlike. It makes you hollow. So the next time someone tells you about Henry VIII's 6 wives, or his political genius, or his legacy, remember this: the man's coffin exploded. His corpse literally couldn't contain the filth inside it. That's the real legacy, The moment when the myth burst apart and the truth spilled out for the world to see. And that's what makes his story unforgettable. Not the throne, not the wars, not the marriages, but the reminder that beneath every crown beats a human heart, fragile and corruptible. Henry VIII's final days weren't the end of an era, they were the revelation of what power really does when it goes unchecked. It rots everything it touches. If you made it this far, you're clearly not afraid of the darker corners of history. So do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me which historical monster you want to uncover next. Because if you think Henry VIII was disturbing, trust me, the past still has plenty more corpses to dig up.